I was watching the Bassmaster Elite Series on Lake Fork, and I found it really interesting. On day one, Jay Shakurat was throwing a Strike King 6XD. And now when I was getting into bass fishing, 8, 9, 10 years, 10 plus years ago, I guess now, a deep diving crankbait was one of the main players, especially when you started to talk late pre-spawn into the post-spawn and during the summer months. You really saw it, especially on ledge fisheries. But not just on ledge fisheries, it was pretty much a player on all different types of bodies of water. When Brandon Polinick won on, I believe, Bull Shoals, he was throwing a deep diving crankbait. Mark Rose was the king of deep water cranking. KVD obviously has been cranking his entire career, really made a living out of cranking when other guys weren't. But throwing a crankbait still has a place, even though forward-facing sonar is in the arsenal. And it's really cool to see this technique kind of come back into the limelight or stand out a little bit more in the limelight in a tournament like Lake Fork. So in today's video, I'm going to really try and break down everything you need to know about throwing a crankbait to help you guys go out and catch more fish. Now, if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Benjamin Nowak, and this channel is dedicated to teaching you bass fishing tips, taking you on trips, and teaching you about techniques like cranking for bass to go out and catch giant fish. So if you guys enjoy this style of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, building this community, and turning this into something really cool. There's been tons of engagement recently, and I really appreciate all the love and engagement I've been receiving on these videos. But I'd love to know, do you guys still throw a crankbait, especially you're in the post-spawn in summertime? Is this still a bait that is in your arsenal? And maybe whether or not you use it with forward-facing sonar. But without further ado, let's dive into this thing. Now, how I plan to break this video down is starting by talking about when I'm going to be throwing a crankbait, particularly as it relates to the late pre-spawn through the post-spawn and into the summer months. This, to me, is one of the best times of year to throw a crankbait outside of maybe the fall. And I'm going to really break down when I'm throwing it, where I'm throwing it, what makes it good, and some of the baits and conditions that I'm looking for to throw a crankbait to have success. Because it's not just a largemouth bait. I think a lot of times guys think about cranking, they think about ledge fishing, they think about largemouth, they think about deep water fish that are out on those ledges. But in today's video, I'm going to really go into two different types of cranking that you guys can use in your arsenal to have success. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about are the two types of crankbaits. And there's really either shallow diving crankbaits or deeper diving crankbaits. That could be mid-depth, that could be deep diving crankbaits like a 6XD. But there's really two styles of crankbaits here. I'm talking about shallow divers, square bills, or like less than 5 foot of water, and I'm talking about deeper than 12 foot of water. Really, for me, this time of year, in the late pre-spawn into the post-spawn, I'm looking for fish in the dirt, up shallow, and I'm looking for fish in that deeper range zone. And the first one is going to be a shallow diving crankbait, a crankbait that dives less than 8 foot of water, less really than 6 foot of water. And these are for those fish that are up shallow, they're chasing those bluegill spawners, they're up there in the dirt, really up shallow, feeding on bait fish right after the spawn. There's obviously a bunch of fish that move out deep, but there's equally as many fish that stay shallow and really maul those bluegills as they're spawning. What's really cool, especially up here in Michigan, you get this bite that happens after the bass spawn where the bluegills will push up, and these bass will hang out around those bluegill beds, and you can catch them on baits like shallow diving square bill crankbaits or shallow diving crankbaits around the grass. These bass will actually stay in those shallow water zones and stay up shallow, feeding on bluegills and crawdads and baitfish up in the shallow water. That, to me, is where a square bill is going to play. I'm going to be looking for those bluegill beds. I'm going to be looking for those rocky bottoms where those crawfish are going to be spawning and hanging out. But I'm going to be fishing it with these square bill crankbaits like the Excite XB1 or a medium diving crankbait less than 6 foot of water. The other cool pattern that a lot of times gets overlooked is fishing grass with a crankbait. And what I'll do is go out to that first grass edge before it drops off into that deeper water. You can fish a crankbait through that grass, kind of keep it up in the column, and you're going to get this crankbait sort of hung in that grass, and you're going to actually pop it out, and that's going to trigger a reaction bite from those fish that are starting to move out deep. But I think a lot of guys will overlook a crankbait, especially for shallow water, especially when they know that those fish are starting to move out deeper. They'll pick up a jig, they'll fish the grass line, they'll pick up a stick worm, maybe a popper. But a crankbait can be a really effective tool to help you cover water and shallow square bill crankbait or shallow diving crankbait can be a really good way to trigger those, early post spawn fish that are still up in the shallow water. And then the other obvious option is a deep diving crankbait. And I really don't fish that middle depth, that 10 to 12 foot diving crankbait. I'm typically going down to the depths. I'm looking for those breaks. I'm looking for those deeper water zones where these fish are going to hang out during the summertime, because as soon as these fish get done spawning and they start to move back out to that deeper water zone, you're going to have big schools of bass that will feed up in deeper water. You guys have seen it in these big ledge fishing tournaments. You're seeing it right now on Lake Fork, where Jay Shakura is targeting hard spots where these fish are transitioning or moving back out deep. But you're going to be fishing those deeper diving crankbaits because they'll move deep pretty quickly and they'll get in really big pods. And what I have here is a Rapala DT14, the DT16, DT20 models, the Strike King 6XD. There's a bunch of great options out there, but I'm going to be fishing those crankbaits that get down to those deeper water zones. I'm really going to be looking for those fish that are schooled up in those deeper water zones, on those ledges, on those hard spots, or, bottom composition areas in those deeper water zones. But a deep diving crankbait is a really, really effective tool to target those fish when they get on those ledges, and especially when they're out there early post spawn and they're feeding up really, really heavily. A crankbait can be a great tool to trigger those fish to bite. Now that we've talked about the two types of crankbaits, let's really start to dive into the when I'm going to be picking these baits up, because there's certain conditions where, for me, a crankbait works most effectively. We'll start with the shallow diving model. I'm going to be picking up a square bill. I'm going to be picking up those shallow diving crankbaits when there's some color in the water, when the water may be a little bit off-colored. I don't like to fish it in super clean water situations. A lot of times fish don't react to a crankbait that great. And there's wind or cloud cover. You need sort of that low light condition, the wind, the cloud cover, to get these fish to react to that bait. It is a reaction style lure, and while it will work sometimes in those slick, dead calm days, where I find it to be the most effective is when the water has some color in it, there's some wind, or it's overcast or cloudy, and these fish don't get a great look at that profile. It's also a faster moving bait, so if I'm looking to cover water and just locate where bass are at, a crankbait's a great tool to help me do that. When I'm going to pick up that deeper diving model is when I have these fish located in deeper water zones. So it's not a cover water tool when I do get out deep. What I'm going to be using it for is when I locate those fish on my side imaging or on my forward-facing sonar to trigger these fish to bite. I'm still looking for some sort of moving water, whether it's current driven. If you're fishing a reservoir and they're pulling current through your body of water, those fish are going to start to lift off the bottom and spread out a little bit. It's going to allow them or make them want to eat a crankbait a little bit better. Or if there's wind and overcast conditions. You can fish it during the sun, especially when you're fishing a deep diving crankbait. It doesn't impact those fish quite as much. But what I find it to be the best is when you have some sort of moving water. So whether that's wind or current driven, you're really looking for moving water situations where they're going to eat that crankbait the best. In those slick or still water days, you may be able to get them to bite a crankbait, but there's a lot of other techniques that work a lot more effectively. But you're going to have to be very precise with that crankbait. Make the perfect cast where it bumps off that, piece of cover down there very specific way, or get it right in front of that fish's face. They'll bite it a lot better when there's moving water or some sort of current in the water to get those fish to lift off the bottom and be willing to chase your bait. Now, what am I looking for when I'm actually targeting these fish in those deep water zones? Well, the first one for me is going to be shell bars. Doesn't matter if you're on the TVA, it doesn't matter if you're up here in Michigan. On reservoirs, you're going to have these hard bottom areas where it's like a shell bar along the bottom. Especially as we get zebra mussels in our lakes, in our rivers, you're going to have these areas that get washed out where there's not silt on the bottom and those shell bars are exposed. What a shell bar is it creates a natural ecosystem for those bass to feed. You're going to have bluegills, you're going to have shad, you're going to have bait fish in these shell bar areas, and it gives those fish a really good ambush point along that ledge or along that deep water zone to hang out and ambush bait. Another great place to look is along contour turns or contour changes. So I'm looking for like channel swing ledges or channel swing banks, or I'm looking for changes along the contour that I'm fishing. If I'm fishing a ledge and there's a small turn where, maybe your contours gap out, it gets a little bit flatter, fish will set up on those areas equally as effectively. And this does not have to be a main river ledge. It doesn't have to be a main river area. It could be, a ledge coming out of a creek. It could be a small high spot, coming along a flat that you're fishing, and you notice that there is a different type of bottom there. Fish will relate to that equally as effectively as your main water ledges. I think a lot of times when guys think about deep water fishing, they think about deep water cranking, they're looking for stuff, on the main river or on the main lake where these fish are going to be setting up. They'll set up equally as effectively on this stuff back up in a creek or back up in a pocket or back up in an area, and it doesn't always have to be like the deepest water in your lake. The reason these fish are getting on these deeper water zones is to feed and feed effectively. They want to be able to feed as bait comes across it, and it gives them the perfect ambush point, whether it's a hard bottom area, a different type of bottom composition, or a small change in the contours for them to hang out and feed. This is what Jay Shakura is doing. He's fishing these secondary ledges where these fish are moving back out towards the main lake to get into their summer patterns. He found this big school of fish on a hard bottom area on a secondary ledge, leading its way back out towards the main lake. So pay attention to these small contour changes, these small differences, these small hard spots. You can locate really big schools of giant fish on your body's water. So now let's dive into the gear that you need to be using for each type of crankbait. And the first one we're going to talk about are shallow diving crankbaits, your square bill style crankbaits. Pretty much for this style of fishing, anytime I'm fishing those shallow water zones, I'm looking for a shorter rod. And to me, I'm using the same rod that I use for my jerkbait situations. It's a TFO Option Bass 7-foot medium. I'm looking for a rod that I can make really precise casts with, and I'm looking for a rod that loads up deep in the blank. And for me, the TFO Option Bass is going to be my square bill setup. I'm then fishing it on 12-pound test fluorocarbon line. That's a little bit heavier than when I throw my jerk baits on. You can go really up to 14 or 15-pound test and not really impact the bait action that much. For me, I'm putting it in cover, I'm bouncing it off the bottom, I'm throwing it around dock posts. I need to have line that's abrasion resistant. And so for me, I'm going anywhere from 12 to 15-pound test fluorocarbon line. And then I'm fishing it on a 6-speed gear ratio reel. It's a little bit slower gear ratio reel. That helps me slow down a little bit. Really anything from a 6 to 7 speed gear ratio is what you need to be throwing for your shallow diving crankbaits. And then the colors that I'm choosing are based on the forage that's in my body of water. If I'm fishing shad-based fisheries, I'll go with your shad style colors. If I'm fishing river systems where I know smallmouth are keyed in on crawdads pretty heavily, I'm going with your cross style colors. And then when I'm fishing for largemouth that are keyed in on bluegill, I'm throwing these bluegill colored baits. There's a lot of great options in this 1.5 or 2.0 size shape. I'm going to leave some of those linked down in the description below for you guys to go check out, but really match the colors that you're throwing to the forage in your bodies of water. You can also get away with that same setup when you're fishing that little bit deeper zone with those medium diving crankbaits around grass, as I mentioned earlier. But I would upsize my line to that 14, 15-pound test. Maybe even upsize to a medium heavy rod. Just something where once that bait gets bogged down in the grass, you can really rip it free successfully. I really like the TFO 7.4 medium heavy cranking rod for that technique. When I get that bait bogged in the grass and you rip it out, it gives you a little bit more backbone to pop that bait free, where you don't have a bunch of grass hanging from the hooks. You want something that's snappy so you can pop that bait free, just like if you're fishing a lipless crankbait, where you're not having a bunch of grass left on the hooks of your bait when you pop it out of the grass. But really, my shallow cranking setup is pretty simple. 7-foot to 7'3", 7'4" cranking rod, medium or medium heavy, then 12 to 15-pound test fluorocarbon line. Colors are going to match the forage that I'm fishing around, and just keep it really simple. Target isolated pieces of cover, docks, laydowns, logs. Another great area is bluegill beds I alluded to earlier, or isolated grass beds where fish are going to be hanging out, kind of rejuvenating before they push out to their deeper water zones. Now for deep diving crankbaits, on the other hand, I think a little bit more specialized gear is really important. You want a cranking rod. You want a rod that will bend deeper down into the blank, and a rod that you can really launch these baits. One of the big keys when you're fishing deeper diving crankbaits is actually getting this bait away from the boat. You want to create distance and separation that will allow that bait to get to its maximum diving depth and stay there for the longest period of time. Now, most of the times when I'm throwing a deep diving crankbait, whether it's for smallmouth or largemouth, I'm throwing it on a 7-10 medium heavy tactical glass rod. They now have the Taction series, which is a very, very similar action, but you want something really, really long to help you create separation from that bait, and it's going to allow you to trigger most of those fish because it's going to get down to that ultimate diving depth and stay down there longer with the longer casts you can make. If you're fishing, your inland bodies of water where you're only trying to get that bait down, 10 to 12 foot of water, you can go with something like the TFO Taction 7.4 medium heavy, but If you want that bait down to maximum depth for the longest period of time, I would go with some specialized sort of gear like a 7.4 to 7.10 rod. You want a launcher that you're going to be able to get that bait away from the boat and keep it down at the depth for the longest period of time. The other benefit for a super long rod is when that fish eats that bait, there's more rod to play those fish, especially when they eat that bait a long ways away. You want to be able to keep those fish pinned on the treble hooks, and a long rod's going to almost act like a rubber band for you. Now, what I mean by that is if you take this crankbait and you hook it to like a tree away from you, just barely put like one treble hook in it, and you shake that rod, if you use a longer rod, it's going to have a slower action and reaction to you moving that rod. Think about it as if a fish were like trying to shake their head. If you have a really fast action rod, it's super snappy. It's going to allow that bait to kind of jiggle a lot in that fish's mouth. With a slower action rod, unloads and loads less quickly, it's going to help that bait stay pinned in that tree, in that fish's mouth when they go to surge or shake their head a long ways away from the boat. Then I'm fishing it on a 6 or 7 speed gear ratio bait casting reel, and I like a reel with a really big spool capacity. What I mean by that, it's got to hold a lot of line. I want to make a long cast, and I want that reel to be as full as it can be so I can get the maximum casting distance with these big crankbaits. And then I'm fishing it on 12 to 15 pound test fluorocarbon line. 12-pound test is really as light as I'll go for the most part. I'm still diving it down, and it's hitting against those shallow of the rocks. It's still bumping into cover down there a lot of times, unless maybe I'm smallmouth fishing on St. Clair and that bait's 2 foot off bottom. But for the most part, I'm fishing this bait along bottom. A little bit heavier line isn't going to have a major impact on the diving depth of your bait, and it's going to help you land more fish without breaking them off. Like I mentioned, it's pretty cool to see a crankbait coming back into the mainstream. When I got into fishing, you had Mark Rose, you had KVD, you had these deep cranking legends who were throwing these big crankbaits to have success on TVA fisheries, as well as other fisheries across the country. So it's cool to see a crankbait come back into play, but it's a bait that really should have stayed in your arsenal over the past 5 to 6 seasons. If you're not throwing a crankbait, whether it's a shallow diving square bill up shallow, like my buddy Alex Rudd, or a deep diving crankbait like these guys on St. Clair or on the ledge fisheries, you need to be throwing one. And hopefully this video will give you guys the information you need to know to have success and confidence to throw a crankbait during the late pre-spawn into the post-spawn and summertime months for bass on your fishery. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, go check this one out right here where I talk about flipping a tube to catch those shallow water fish. It's a bait that not a lot of guys are throwing, but a tube still catches a lot of big ones. Hit that button right there to subscribe to the channel. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue your passion.